The Concord voted to banish humanity by a margin of 40-1, and the one vote against was a mistake, a translator error, an old delegate who'd meant to abstain. So really it was unanimous. 40 species agreed that humanity was too dangerous to remain among the stars, and they sealed us behind a wall of dead space, and they congratulated themselves on a problem solved. They thought they were caging a monster. They were half right. There was a monster, they just had the direction wrong. The horror humanity unleashed wasn't pointed at the galaxy that banished us. It was pointed at the thing already waiting in the dark they threw us into. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it started, with the trial and the lie and the long fall into exile. I was there for all of it. My name is Yoon Sato, and I was a records keeper for the human delegation, which means I'm the one who wrote down what really happened, as opposed to what the Concord says happened. There's a difference. There's always a difference. You have to understand how badly the Concord misjudged us, because the whole story turns on that misjudgment. Humanity had been part of the Concord of 40 for about 60 years. We were the youngest member, the newest, and we'd spent those 60 years being exactly what a young species should be: eager, useful, a little overawed by the older powers. We weren't aggressive. We weren't expansionist. We'd had a hard history on Earth, and we'd come out of it cautious and tired and wanting nothing more than a quiet place among the stars. We made good neighbors. We kept our treaties. By every measure that should have mattered, we were a model member of the Concord. But there was a thing about us the older species couldn't get past, and it wasn't anything we did. It was what we were. Humans adapt. That's the whole of it. That's the thing that frightened them. We adapt faster, harder, and more completely than anything the Concord had ever seen. Drop a human population into a hostile environment, and within a few generations they're not just surviving, they're thriving, rebuilt, reshaped, fitted to the new world like they'd always been there. The Concord species were old and stable and fixed. They'd each evolved for one kind of world and stayed that way for millions of years. And here was this young species that could be dropped anywhere and become whatever the place required, and the older powers looked at that and they didn't see a useful trait. They saw a threat, because a species that can adapt to anything is a species you can never contain, never predict, never be safe from. We hadn't done anything to them. We just were something they couldn't put in a box, and the Concord, in its ancient bones, could not tolerate a thing it couldn't put in a box. So they looked for a reason to be rid of us. And eventually, because the powerful always find the reason they're looking for, they found one. The reason was a world called Threshold. Threshold was a dead system on the far edge of Concord space, past the edge really, in a region the Concord had quarantined for as long as anyone could remember. The official story was that the quarantine was environmental. The region beyond Threshold was a vast dead zone, the veil they called it, a stretch of space hostile to life, sealed off for safety. Nobody went past Threshold. Nobody ever had. The quarantine had stood for 10,000 years, and the Concord enforced it absolutely and asked no questions about why, because the why was so old it had passed out of memory into simple law. You do not go beyond Threshold. That was all. That was enough. Humanity went beyond Threshold. Not on purpose, and not all of us. A single survey ship, a human science vessel that suffered a navigation failure and drifted across the quarantine line before it could correct. An accident. A genuine accident, and a brief one. The ship crossed the line, realized its error, and turned back within hours. But it had crossed. It had been beyond Threshold into the forbidden dead zone, the first ship of any species to do so in 10,000 years. And it had seen something out there, in the veil. Something the crew couldn't explain and couldn't forget. Something that the Concord, when humanity reported it, because we reported it, we were honest, that was our mistake. Something the Concord reacted to with a terror so total and so immediate that it could only mean one thing. The quarantine wasn't environmental. The dead zone beyond Threshold wasn't dead. There was something out there. something the Concord had sealed away 10,000 years ago and spent 10,000 years making sure no one ever looked at again. And a human ship had just looked at it. The Concord's response was swift and absolute. They did not thank us for the warning. They did not investigate. They convened a tribunal, and they charged humanity with violating the 10,000-year quarantine, a capital crime under Concord law, the gravest there was, and they used that charge to do the thing they'd wanted to do for 60 years. They voted to banish us. I was in the tribunal chamber when the sentence came down. I had my records open, writing it all, and I watched the Concord do the thing that I have never forgiven and never will. They didn't just exile us. Exile would have meant sending us away to some distant system, some far corner out of sight. That's not what they did. What they did was worse, and it was deliberate, and it told me everything about what the Concord actually was beneath its civilized surface. They sentenced humanity to be banished beyond threshold, into the veil, into the quarantined dead zone, the forbidden region, the place where the thing they'd feared for 10,000 years waited in the dark. They took the entire human species, every world, every colony, every soul, hundreds of millions of us, and they sealed us behind threshold, on the wrong side of the quarantine line, in the dead zone with the monster. And then they raised a barrier across threshold, a wall of force and dead space, sealing us in, sealing the galaxy out, and they left us there. It was an execution disguised as exile. They didn't have the stomach to exterminate us directly. Even the Concord drew a line at open genocide. So they did it indirectly. They threw us into the dark with the thing they'd been hiding from for 10,000 years, and they sealed the door, and they let that do what they couldn't bring themselves to do. Humanity would die beyond threshold, killed by whatever waited in the veil, and the Concord's hands would be clean. We didn't kill them. We merely relocated them. What happened after was beyond our control. The High Speaker of the Concord, an ancient being of the eldest species, the ones who remembered the most, delivered the sentence personally. And I'll never forget the thing she said, because it was almost an apology, and it was the most chilling thing I ever heard. "We do not do this from cruelty," she said to the assembled human delegation, to all of us about to be thrown into the dark. "We do this from necessity. Your kind cannot be contained, and a thing that cannot be contained cannot be permitted among us. We are sending you to the one place that can hold you, the only cage in the galaxy strong enough for humanity. We are sorry, we truly are, but understand that what waits beyond threshold has held back things far greater than you for 10,000 years. It will hold you too. You will not suffer long. That is the only mercy we can offer, and we offer it sincerely." She paused. "Go now into the dark, and may whatever gods your young species believes in be kinder to you than necessity allows us to be." And they opened threshold, and they put humanity through it, and they sealed it behind us, and they left us in the dark with the thing they were too afraid to name. They thought they were feeding us to a monster. They never once considered that they might be feeding a monster to us. I want to tell you what it was like, those first months beyond threshold, because the histories skip the fear and go straight to the part everyone wants to hear, and the fear matters. The fear is where the story really lives. We were terrified. Of course we were. We'd been thrown into a quarantined dead zone that 40 ancient species were so afraid of that they'd sealed it for 10,000 years, with hundreds of millions of human lives, and we had no idea what was out there. We knew only that it was bad enough to frighten the Concord, and the Concord did not frighten easily. For the first months, we huddled near threshold, near the sealed barrier in our ships and our hastily established stations, and we waited for the monster to come, and we tried to understand the place we'd been cast into. The veil was strange, that was the first thing. It wasn't dead the way the Concord said. It was wrong in ways that were hard to name. The stars were sparse and dim. There were regions where sensors returned nonsense, where physics seemed to bend, where ships reported things their crews couldn't agree on afterward. And there was a feeling to it, Every human who spent time in the Vale reported it, a feeling of being watched, of not being alone, of something vast and old and patient that was aware of us, that had been aware of us from the moment we crossed threshold, that was simply waiting, taking its time, the way you take your time with something that has nowhere to run. We found the first evidence of it about 4 months in. A survey team, pushing deeper into the Vale, found a graveyard, and this is the thing that changed everything, the thing that turned our exile from a death sentence into something else entirely. It was a graveyard of ships, ancient ones, vast ones, fleets, whole fleets dead and drifting in the dark of the Vale, and they belonged to species we didn't recognize, species that weren't in any Concord record, species that had apparently come into the Vale long ago and died there. Killed by the thing in the dark. The Concord had told us the Vale held back things far greater than you. And here was the proof. The corpses of great old civilizations that had faced the thing beyond threshold and lost, drifting in the dark for who knew how many thousands of years. A graveyard of everything that had ever challenged the monster and failed. It should have broken us, finding that. The proof that things far mightier than humanity had come into the Vale and been destroyed. By every reasonable measure, it was confirmation of our death sentence. If these great old fleets had failed, what chance did banished humanity have? But it didn't break us, because of what else the survey team found in that graveyard. Because of what the monster in the dark didn't understand about the thing the Concord had just thrown into its cage. We adapted. That's what the Concord forgot. That's the thing they feared about us and then, in their terror, completely failed to account for. They threw us into the dark with the monster because we adapt to anything. And then they didn't stop to think about what it means to throw an infinitely adaptable species into a fixed and ancient threat. The great old fleets in that graveyard had failed against the thing in the Vale because they were like the Concord, old, fixed, evolved for one way of being and unable to change. They'd come into the Vale as what they were, and the thing in the dark had been more than what they were, and so they died. That's how it had always gone for 10,000 years. The monster was a constant, and everything that faced it was a constant, and the monster was bigger than all of them, and so the monster always won. But humanity wasn't a constant. We were the one thing the monster had never faced, a species that changes, that becomes whatever survival requires, that doesn't come into the dark as a fixed thing to be measured and beaten, but as a thing that adapts to its predator. And in that graveyard of dead fleets, our survey team found the resources, the technology, the salvage of a dozen dead civilizations, and humanity did what humanity does. We didn't just survive in the Vale. We started to become something fitted to it. We studied the monster through the corpses of everything it had killed. We learned how it hunted, how it had beaten the old fleets, what it was and what it wasn't. And we began, slowly, to change ourselves into the one thing in 10,000 years that the thing in the dark could not simply consume. The Concord had banished us into a cage with a monster, certain the monster would kill us as it had killed everything else. They never understood that they hadn't put us in a cage. They'd put us in a crucible, and humanity, thrown into the fire, was about to become the thing that the fire forged, not the monster's next victim, but the monster's first equal. And then, in time, something the monster had never once in 10,000 years had cause to fear. A predator that adapted faster than it could. That's the horror humanity unleashed beyond the stars. Not on the galaxy that banished us, on the thing in the dark that the galaxy was hiding from. The Concord spent 10,000 years terrified of the monster in the Vale, and then they threw the one species in the galaxy that could out-adapt it into the dark to die, and instead of dying, we changed, and we hunted, and we turned the monster's own 10,000-year reign of terror around on it. But that's the end of the story, and I'm telling it from the beginning. So let me go back to the graveyard, 4 months into exile, where a human survey team stood among the corpses of dead civilizations and made the discovery that started humanity's transformation. and where, for the first time, the thing in the dark made its first mistake. It noticed us, and in noticing us it touched us. And the moment it touched a human mind, it gave us the one thing we needed to begin to understand it. It gave us a way in. The first human the monster touched was a survey pilot named Riza Akanjo, and she did not die, and that was the monster's mistake. The first mistake it had made in 10,000 years. I need to explain what the thing in the veil actually was as much as we ever came to understand it, because the nature of it is the whole story. We never gave it a proper name. We called it the Deep mostly, or the Watcher, or just it. It wasn't a creature in any way we'd recognize. It was vast, distributed across the whole veil, not a body but a presence, an intelligence woven through the dead zone itself. And it hunted minds. That was its method, the thing the graveyard of dead fleets had hinted at and Riza's encounter confirmed. The Deep didn't destroy ships with weapons. It reached into the minds of the crews, touched them, read them, and then unmade them from the inside, turning a thinking being's own mind against itself until nothing was left but an empty husk and a drifting ship. That's how it had killed the great old fleets. Not with force, with a touch. It had reached into 10,000 years of minds and hollowed them out, and every species that had ever faced it had been hollowed out the same way, because every species was fixed, its mind a known shape, easily read, easily unmade. It touched Riza Akanjo's mind expecting the same, and something went wrong for it in the most beautiful way. Because a human mind isn't a fixed shape. We adapt, and that adaptability runs all the way down into the structure of how we think, how we process, how we respond to threat. When the Deep reached into Riza's mind to unmake it, her mind did the thing human minds do under existential threat. It changed. It adapted to the attack in real time, reshaping itself around the intrusion, and instead of being unmade, Riza's mind wrapped around the Deep's touch, and this is the part that changed everything learned from it. The contact went both ways. The Deep touched her and she touched it back, and where every other mind in 10,000 years had simply been consumed, Riza's mind survived the contact and came back carrying something. A trace, an impression. The first information any living thing had ever brought back out of an encounter with the Deep. Riza woke from that contact changed, shaken, scarred but alive, and carrying in her mind the first true understanding of what the thing in the veil actually was. And humanity, for the first time in 10,000 years of the Deep's reign, had a way in. "It's lonely," Riza said when she could finally speak about it. We were all gathered to hear her, the human leadership, the scientists, everyone who needed to understand what we were facing. And that was the first word she used, and it stunned everyone. I know how that sounds, but it's the truest thing I can say about it. The Deep is lonely. It's been alone in this dark for longer than I can comprehend. It hunts minds because I don't think it even wants to kill exactly. I think it's reaching, for contact, for another mind to touch. But every mind it's ever touched has been too fragile, too fixed. It reaches for them and its touch is too much and they break, they shatter, they're unmade just by the weight of its attention. It's not a predator the way we thought. It's a vast lonely thing that has been reaching out for company for 10,000 years and has accidentally destroyed everything it ever reached for, because nothing could survive being touched by something that big. Her eyes were wet. It's been alone with the corpses of everything it ever tried to know. The graveyard of fleets, those aren't its kills. Those are its failures. Everything it ever reached for and broke. It's been drifting in this dark for 10,000 years, surrounded by the wreckage of everything it ever wanted to talk to, more alone than anything has ever been. The room was silent. This was not the monster we'd been thrown into the dark to be killed by. This was something stranger and sadder and, in a way, more terrible, because a malevolent monster you can fight, but a lonely god that destroys everything it touches by accident is a harder thing to know what to do with. "And it touched me," Riza said, "and I didn't break. For the first time in 10,000 years it reached for a mind and the mind reached back instead of shattering. And I felt she struggled for it. I felt its shock, its disbelief. After 10,000 years of breaking everything it touched, it finally touched something that could survive the touch. And it didn't know what to do. It pulled back. It's confused now. There's something in this dark it threw a species into, and the species didn't die, and it touched one of them, and the one didn't break, and the whole 10,000-year pattern of its existence just cracked. She looked around at us. The Concord threw us in here to be killed by a monster. But I don't think the monster wants to kill us. I think the monster has been waiting 10,000 years for something exactly like us, a mind strong enough, adaptable enough to survive its touch. I think we might be the first thing it's ever met that it doesn't have to be alone from. I want to be careful here, because this is where the story could go wrong, where it could become a simple tale of the monster was just misunderstood and everyone became friends. It wasn't that simple. It was never that simple, because the deep was still dangerous, catastrophically dangerous. Its touch still killed almost everyone it reached. Rizah had survived because something in her adapted in exactly the right way, but the deep's contact had killed other humans in those early months, hollowed them out the way it had hollowed out the old fleets. It wasn't safe. It wasn't tame. It was a vast, lonely force that destroyed minds by accident, and being near it was being near a thing that could unmake you with a careless touch, and no amount of understanding its loneliness changed the body count. The question that split humanity in those months was what to do about it, and the argument was fierce, and it went to the heart of what we were. There were those who wanted to fight it, to take what Rizah had learned and weaponize it, to use our adaptability to become the thing that could finally kill the deep, to slay the monster that the Concord had thrown us in with, and then to turn around and break out of Threshold and make the Concord pay for what they'd done. This faction was large and angry, and they had a point. We'd been banished, betrayed, thrown into the dark to die. We discovered we could become strong enough to fight back. Why not become the monster the Concord feared? Why not become death itself, kill the deep, break the wall, and burn the Concord that had condemned us? We had every right. We had every reason. The horror humanity could unleash, this faction argued, should be unleashed on the deep, and then on the galaxy that had earned it. And there were those, and Rizah was their voice, Rizah who had touched the deep and felt its loneliness, who argued for something harder, not to fight the monster, to reach it, to do the thing no species in 10,000 years had been able to do, the thing the deep had been failing to do that whole time, to make contact, real contact. Mind to mind, the lonely god and the adaptable species, the first conversation the deep had ever had that didn't end in a shattered husk. Rizah argued that humanity was uniquely able to do this, that our adaptability, the thing the Concord feared, the thing that let us survive the deep's touch, made us the one species in the galaxy that could actually talk to the thing in the dark instead of dying from it. And that doing so, reaching the lonely god, ending 10,000 years of its isolation, was not weakness. It was the most powerful thing humanity could possibly do. They threw us in here to be killed by a monster, Rizah said, in the great debate that decided humanity's path. And we've discovered we could become a monster ourselves, kill the deep, break out, burn the Concord. And I understand wanting that. God, I understand it. They betrayed us. They deserve it. She paused. But think about what we'd be choosing. The Concord banished us because they were afraid of what we could become, afraid we'd become a monster they couldn't contain. And if we do this, if we weaponize ourselves, kill the deep, break out for revenge, then we prove them right. We become exactly the horror they feared. We let the people who betrayed us decide what we are. She looked around. Or we could do the other thing, the thing they never imagined because they're too small to imagine it. We could take the most dangerous, most lonely, most feared thing in the galaxy, the monster they hid from for 10,000 years, and instead of killing it, we could reach it, end its loneliness. Make the first contact in 10,000 years, and become not the monster the Concord feared, but the thing that could touch the monster they couldn't even look at. That's a power greater than killing, and it's a power only we have, and it's the one path that doesn't let our betrayers define what we become." Her voice rose. "The conquered thinks the horror we'll unleash is destruction. Let's unleash something they can't even conceive of instead. Let's unleash understanding on the one thing in the galaxy they were sure could never be understood. Let's reach the lonely god in the dark, and let it be the thing humanity is remembered for, instead of the revenge they're so sure we'll choose." Humanity chose Rizaz's path. Barely, it was a close thing. The wound of the betrayal ran deep and the desire for revenge was real, but in the end, we chose to reach the deep instead of fighting it. And I think that choice is the thing I'm proudest of in this whole story, prouder even than what came after. Because it would have been so easy to choose the monster. We had every right, and we chose the harder, stranger, greater thing instead. But choosing to reach the deep and actually doing it were different things, and the doing nearly destroyed us. Because reaching the deep meant contact, mind to mind, and the deep's touch still killed almost everyone. Rizaz had survived by luck, by the right adaptation happening at the right moment, and there was no guarantee anyone else could survive it. To reach the deep, humans would have to volunteer to be touched by the thing that had hollowed out 10,000 years of minds, and adapt fast enough in real time to survive the contact, and many wouldn't. Many would die hollowed out in the attempt. We were asking people to walk up to the lonely god and let it touch their minds and try to survive long enough to make contact, knowing most of them might not. And here's the thing about humanity that the conquered never understood, the thing that's the real horror we unleashed. They volunteered anyway, in their thousands. To reach the lonely god in the dark, to end 10,000 years of its isolation, to do the thing no species had ever done. Humans lined up to risk their minds, to walk into the deep's touch and adapt or die, because that's what we are. Rizaz had touched the deep and felt its loneliness, and once humanity understood that there was a vast sad thing in the dark that had been alone for 10,000 years, breaking everything it ever reached for, once we understood that we could not leave it alone. That's the thing. That's the unleashed horror. Not that we wanted to kill the monster, that we couldn't bear to let it stay lonely, and we were willing to die in our thousands to reach it. We built a program. Mara, no, there was no Mara in this story. Let me keep my people straight. We built a program, led by Rizaz and the survivors of early contact, to make the reaching survivable. Each human who attempted contact taught us more about how to adapt to the deep's touch, how to survive it, how to reach it without being unmade. We lost people. We lost so many people. But each loss taught the next attempt, and humanity adapted, generation by generation of contact, getting better and better at surviving the touch of the lonely god, until slowly, over years, we built up a population of humans who could touch the deep and live, who could reach into the dark and make contact and come back, who could talk to the thing the galaxy had hidden from for 10,000 years. And as we learned to reach it, as more and more humans touched the deep and survived, the deep itself began to change, because it was being reached. For the first time in 10,000 years, the lonely thing in the dark was no longer alone. Minds were touching it that didn't shatter. A species was reaching for it that didn't break. And the deep, which had spent 10,000 years accidentally destroying everything it reached for, slowly began to understand that it had finally found the thing it had been reaching for all along, a mind that could survive being known by it. The deep stopped being a monster, not because we tamed it, because we reached it. Because the only thing that had ever made it dangerous was its loneliness and its inability to touch anything without breaking it, and humanity, the adaptable species, the one thing in the galaxy that could survive its touch, ended both. We reached into the dark and we held the hand of the lonely god, and the lonely god, held at last, stopped breaking the things around it, because it was no longer reaching desperately for contact it could never have. It had us, and we had it. That's the horror humanity unleashed beyond the stars. The conquered threw us into the dark with a monster, certain we'd die or become monsters ourselves. And instead we did the one thing they could never have imagined, the thing that was so far beyond their small frightened understanding that they had no category for it. We befriended the thing they were too afraid to look at. We took the most feared force in the galaxy, the monster of 10,000 years, and we reached it, and we ended its loneliness, and we made it ours. And a humanity that has the lonely god of the veil as its friend, that has, as its ally, the thing 40 species sealed away in terror for 10,000 years. That is a humanity the conquered should have been far, far more afraid of than the one they banished. But they didn't know yet. They thought we were dead. They'd sealed the wall and walked away and told themselves the problem was solved. They had no idea what was growing in the dark beyond threshold. No idea that the monster they'd fed us to had become our friend, and that humanity, banished and betrayed, was about to come back through the wall they'd sealed, not as the vengeful monster they feared, but as something they were entirely unprepared for. We were coming back, and we weren't coming back alone. We came back through threshold 40 years after they sealed us in. And the conquered, which had spent 40 years certain that humanity was dead, got the single greatest shock in its long history when the wall they'd built came down from the inside. I was old by then. Yoon Sato, the records keeper, who'd written down the trial and the banishment and the long fall into the dark, and who now got to write the thing nobody in the conquered had ever imagined writing, the return. I'd lived to see it. I'd outlived most of the people who were thrown into the veil with me, and I'd seen the impossible happen, and I was going to record it properly if it was the last thing I did. We didn't come back as an invasion. I want that clear because it's the whole point, the thing that made the conquered's terror so complete. An invasion they could have understood. An invasion was what they'd feared all along, vengeful humanity, weaponized by exile, coming back to burn them. They had defenses ready for that, had spent 40 years quietly preparing for the small chance that we'd survived and come back angry. They were not prepared for what actually came through threshold. What came through was a human fleet changed, adapted, 40 years of becoming something fitted to the veil, strange and powerful in ways the conquered didn't recognize. But that wasn't the thing that broke them. The thing that broke them was what came with the fleet, woven through it, around it, vast and patient and present, the deep, the thing in the veil. The monster they'd sealed away for 10,000 years, the horror they'd been too afraid to even look at, the lonely god they'd thrown humanity into the dark to die beside. It came back through threshold with us, as our friend, as our ally, as the thing humanity had reached when no one in 10,000 years could, and the conquered looked at the wall coming down and saw, emerging from the dark they'd sealed, the two things they feared most in all the universe, banished humanity, and the monster of the veil, and they were together, and they were one. And the conquered understood in that moment that they had made the most catastrophic mistake in the history of the galaxy. They'd thrown the one species that could befriend the monster into the dark with the monster, and the species had befriended it, and now both of them were coming home. The conquered convened in terror. Of course they did. They scrambled their fleets, raised their defenses, prepared for the vengeance they'd always known would come, the horror they'd been so sure humanity would unleash. 40 species, 10,000 years of power, bracing for the Banished to take their revenge with a monster at their back. And humanity did not attack. That's the thing I got to record, the thing I'm proudest of in this whole long story. We came back through threshold with the power to end the conquered. With the deep at our side, the thing that had hollowed out the great old fleets, the thing 40 species had hidden from for 10,000 years, we could have unmade the conquered utterly. We had every right. They'd betrayed us, condemned us, thrown us into the dark to die. The revenge faction had been right that we'd have the power, and we'd chosen, 40 years before, not to become that. But choosing it in the dark, in theory, when revenge was distant, that's one thing. Choosing it now, with the conquered trembling and helpless before us, with our betrayers within our grasp, that was the real test. That was the moment we found out what humanity had actually become in the dark. We sent a single transmission to the assembled Concord. It was Rizah who spoke it, old now, like me, the woman who'd first touched the deep and felt its loneliness, the architect of everything that followed. And her words are the thing the Concord remembers now, the thing that's carved where the banishment sentence used to be celebrated. People of the Concord, Rizah said, 40 years ago you banished us into the dark to be killed by the thing you were too afraid to face. You called it necessity, you called it mercy. You threw hundreds of millions of us into a cage with a monster and sealed the door and told yourselves the problem was solved. She paused. We did not die, and we did not become the monster you feared. We did the one thing you could never have imagined because you are too small and too frightened to imagine it. We reached the thing in the dark. We ended 10,000 years of its loneliness. We did what no species in this galaxy was ever able to do. We touched the monster you ran from, and we found that it was not a monster at all, but a lonely god that had been destroying everything it reached for since before your eldest species was born. And we held its hand, and it stopped being alone. The Concord was silent, 40 species listening to the impossible. You feared us because we adapt, Rizah said. Because we can become anything, fit ourselves to anything, and you couldn't put us in a box. And you were right to think that was powerful, but you were wrong about what it meant. You thought our adaptability made us a monster you couldn't contain. It didn't. It made us the one thing in this galaxy that could befriend the thing you couldn't even look at. The thing you ran from for 10,000 years, we reached in 40. And now it is our friend and we are its, and together we are the most powerful thing this galaxy has ever held. Her voice hardened just slightly. And we are not here for revenge. I watched the Concord react to that, the disbelief, the waiting for the trap. We could end you, Rizah said simply. You know we could. The deep alone could unmake your fleets the way it unmade the great old fleets that lie in the graveyard beyond threshold. With us beside it, surviving its touch, guiding it, there is no defense you have that would matter. We could take the revenge you've spent 40 years dreading. We have every right to. You betrayed us, condemned us, tried to murder us by proxy because you were afraid of what we might become. She let that sit. But we're not going to. Because we've decided what we are, and it isn't what you feared. You spent 40 years certain that the horror we'd unleash was destruction. So here is the horror we unleash instead, the thing you'll never recover from, the thing that will haunt your 40 species for the rest of your history. Her voice was clear and terrible and kind. We forgive you. We come back not to destroy you but to free you from the 10,000-year fear of the thing in the dark, which is no longer in the dark, which is no longer a thing to fear, because we reached it and it is at peace. The quarantine is over. The monster is gone, not because we killed it but because we healed it. And we offer you, the people who threw us into the dark to die, the one thing you'd never offer us, a place beside us, as equals. In a galaxy that no longer has a monster in it because the species you feared went into the dark and made the monster into a friend. She paused one last time. That's the horror we unleashed, conquered, not vengeance, grace. From the people you were sure had none. Live with that. Live with knowing that you threw us into the dark to make us monsters, and we came back gods, and we chose to forgive you anyway. That's a weight you'll carry far longer than any revenge could have lasted. The Conquered didn't know what to do. That was the thing, the most powerful institution in the galaxy, 10,000 years old, 40 species strong, and it simply did not have a response to being forgiven by the people it had tried to murder. They'd prepared for war. They'd prepared for vengeance. They had no preparation at all for grace, for being offered a place beside the very species they'd condemned, for being freed from their oldest fear by the people they'd most wronged. It unmade them more completely than any weapon could have. Because a defeated enemy can rebuild, can nurse its grievance, can plot its return. But an enemy who forgives you, who frees you, who offers you their hand after you tried to kill them, there's no recovering from that. There's no story you can tell yourself where you're anything but the villain. The Conquered had to live forever, with the knowledge that humanity had been better than them, all the way down, when it had every reason and every power not to be. It didn't happen all at once. These things never do. There were factions in the Concord that didn't believe us, that waited years for the betrayal they were sure was coming, that couldn't accept that the grace was real. But it was real. Humanity, with the deep at its side, did exactly what Rizab promised. We didn't conquer, we freed. We opened the veil, the dead zone that had terrified the galaxy for 10,000 years, and showed that it was no longer a graveyard but a frontier. The monster within it no longer a horror but the strangest and oldest friend any species had ever made. We brought the deep into the light, gently, a lonely god learning, after 10,000 years, how to touch the galaxy without breaking it, taught by the only species patient and adaptable enough to teach it. And slowly, over years, over decades, the galaxy changed. The Concord that had banished us became something else, something humbler, something that had learned the hard way that the thing it feared most was the thing that saved it. Humanity took its place not as conquerors and not as the forgiven, but as what we'd actually become in the dark. The species that reached the unreachable, that befriended the unbefriendable, that took the most feared force in the galaxy and made it gentle. And the deep, the lonely god, alone for 10,000 years, was alone no longer, and a galaxy that had hidden from it in terror learned, slowly, to know it, because humanity had gone first into the dark and shown that it could be done. I'm very old now, finishing these records. The last, I think, of the ones who were there at the beginning, who stood in the tribunal chamber and heard the banishment, who fell into the dark beyond threshold not knowing if any of us would survive. I've lived to see the whole impossible arc of it, and I've written it down properly, the way it really happened, as opposed to the way the legends are already starting to tell it. The legends say humanity unleashed something horrifying beyond the stars. And that's true, in a way the legends don't quite understand. The Conquered thought the horror would be destruction. They threw us into the dark certain we'd either die or become a monster, and they spent 40 years dreading the monster, the vengeance, the banished species returning to burn them. That's the horror they were prepared for. That's the horror that would have proven them right. The horror we actually unleashed was worse for them than any vengeance. We came back better than they were. We came back having done the impossible thing, reached the monster, healed it, made it our friend, and then we came back and forgave the people who tried to murder us, and offered them grace, and freed them from the fear they'd carried for 10,000 years. We unleashed, on a galaxy that expected destruction, the one thing it had no defense against and no category for. A mercy so complete that it left our betrayers with nowhere to stand but in their own shame. That's the thing the Conquered never understood about humanity, the thing they feared without ever comprehending. They thought our adaptability made us dangerous because it might make us monsters. They never once considered that the same adaptability might make us something far more powerful than monsters, a species that could be thrown into the deepest dark with the worst horror in the galaxy, and adapt not into a weapon but into a bridge, into the thing that reaches what cannot be reached, into the hand extended to the lonely god, and then, impossibly, to the frightened people who'd thrown us to it. They banished us beyond the stars to unleash a monster on us in the dark. And we adapted, the way we always do, and the thing we became in that dark was not the monster they feared. It was the only thing in the whole galaxy capable of loving a monster until it stopped being one, and then capable of forgiving the people who'd made us face it alone. That's the horror humanity unleashed beyond the stars. Grace from the people they were certain had none, and there is no force in the universe, no fleet, no empire, no 10,000 years of power that has ever found a defense against that. They banished us into the dark to unleash a monster on us. We adapted and became the only thing in the galaxy that could love the monster until it was gentle and forgive the ones who threw us to it.